coming out tonight for this presentation, Why Aren't There More Black People in Oregon? A Hidden History by Walidah Imarisha, presented by the West Linn Alliance for Inclusive Community, Mary's Woods Retirement Center, and Respond to Racism. My name is Bruce Poinsett. I'm the Media Action Team Leader for Respond. And yeah, I know some of you we're coming in from different places. Some of you probably seen Walidah before, maybe on OPB, CBS, the yearly stories about how Oregon was supposed to be a wholly white state. But my first interaction was actually, it was 2011 at a Justice for Troy Davis rally, just coming straight out of college. I remember seeing this woman with a big afro and a bullhorn, just directing traffic. Man, I'm in the right place. And I go on as working as a reporter with the Scanner. Our paths would cross, both with her work as a presenter doing Oregon Black history, doing the history of hip hop, doing alternatives to prison, her work as an author and a poet, and such works as Angels with Dirty Faces and Octavia's Brood, sci-fi, visionary fiction, anthology, and her work as a professor at PSU, among other places, and then just her presence seemingly in all of the organizing spaces. But I say all that to say that I'm not doing her credentials or her resume any justice right now, but at the end of the day, what I just want to say is that her work ethic, her vision, and the care she puts into this and all the things she does is an inspiration both to me and many people throughout the state. And I feel honored and privileged to call her a friend. I think we're all honored and privileged to have her here tonight. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Walidah Imarisha.
To have these conversations. And so you heard a little bit about me, about my work, how I got here. Just a little bit more personally, I'm not from Oregon. I grew up on military bases, mostly overseas. And so I grew up mostly in places like Iceland and Germany, which are very white, both the snow and the people. But I grew up on military bases, and because the military disproportionately recruits folks of color, the communities I grew up in were mostly people of color. And so I moved to Springfield, Oregon to go to high school. And my first question was, why aren't there more black people in Oregon? And my second question was, and should I be worried? And we will talk about both of those questions. Spoilers, yes. So, right? I was lucky enough while I was still in high school to go hear a presentation by Dr. Daryl Milner at the University of Oregon. He's one of the preeminent historians on the Black experience in the West. And I was lucky enough to go to Portland State and have him be a mentor and to have him teach there long enough to come full circle and teach with him as a colleague in the Black Studies department at Portland State. And so I like to make sure that I'm mentioning the names of the folks who have been preserving this history for us, because the subheader is a hidden history. And this history has been purposely hidden, obfuscated, and in some cases the attempt to destroy it. And there are folks who have been working for decades to preserve it, to make sure that we do not forget and that we can learn from it. And my work is absolutely resting on their work, and I hope doing justice and credit to their work. So that's a little bit about me. The program tonight is going to be a little more interactive, so I'm not just going to lecture at you and then be like, in 1849, in that voice. Apparently that's the voice you have to use when you lecture. I will not be using that. So we're actually going to explore an Oregon Black History timeline I've created, which I'll talk a little bit more. Then we'll have some large group conversation, and then if we have time, we'll have some small group conversation about sort of the current state of Oregon and its connection to this history. So the first part of the program, we are going to engage with the Oregon Black History timeline that I created. And so it is a timeline and a tool that I created to be able to have these conversations in more interactive ways in community. And so it is a timeline of Oregon Black history. It is also a timeline of Oregon history, because Oregon Black history is Oregon history, just like the history of people of color is the history of the United States. And we can't begin to understand this place that we live without understanding and knowing that history. And so just a few disclaimers about the timeline, which some folks might have seen. I hung it up around the room when I thought we were going to be much smaller. So the timeline is by no means comprehensive. This is not the full timeline. My full timeline is probably 3 times this long. I just keep making slides. I love them. I'm like, that's great. I'm going to make a slide for it. But even that one is not comprehensive. It is some key moments that get us talking about the history of race, identity, and power in Oregon and in the larger United States. And so it is focused on Oregon Black history because that is my area of scholarship and expertise. I've tried to include a few slides from other communities of color so we can compare and contrast those experiences. But it's important to learn the individual histories of repression and resistance for each community of color. Though the oppressive forces came from the same place, they manifested differently for different communities of color, and it's important to learn those histories. So don't go away and be like, I listened to Walidah talk for an hour, so I know everything about all brown people. Don't do me like that, as folks have. Right? The goal is not to memorize this timeline, so I will give you access to the timeline in a couple different forms. So as you're touring it, you do not have to furiously be taking notes unless you want to. You will get access to it. The goal of touring it is that actually engage with the information. And so you are actually going to be touring it in pairs, which is why you made a new friend. Ha-ha! So this is, I usually am like, this is not a library, you can talk. Maybe we use our slightly quieter but the goal is to have dialogue. So as you and your partner are seeing the material, to engage with it and to have conversation. You may not read every single slide, you may not get to see every slide, that's all right. The goal is to have conversation. We're going to talk about it when we come back together. The last disclaimer I want to make is that especially for folks who have not encountered it before, some of the images and information is shocking and disturbing. It's obviously not there for shock value. It's there because this is the history of this place and because it's the lived reality of folks who are here. And there are folks in this community carrying the weight of this history every single day on their backs. And if this is the first time you've encountered that, that's an immense privilege, right? And it's important to acknowledge that. And my understanding and definition of community is that if one of us is carrying a burden, then we all carry that burden and work to change it. To just ground us in this conversation, some headlines about Oregon. As Bruce was saying, the yearly stories about how white Portland is specifically reflective of the rest of Oregon as well. So I just want to start out, and we have folks with microphones who are going to come and bring you a microphone. So when you please raise your hand and wait till you get a microphone just to make sure everyone can hear you. Please don't do the I speak loud, right? Because, it's a big room, there's a lot of people. We want to make sure everyone can hear and everyone can be included in the conversation. So I just want to start by asking folks, what was new information, what was surprising information that you encountered in the timeline? What stood out to folks? All of it was new.
I think the stuff
we're just bringing a microphone. Thank you so much, Betty.
Hi, so all of it, I felt like most of it was new to me. I was not familiar at all with the history
thing to recognize is that laws were left on the books, even when technically they were no longer legal, federal law superseding state law. They were left on the books to be very clear about the kind of place Oregon wanted to be, and the kind of place it would enforce itself, legal or illegal. So, thank you.
I was just shocked that it took until 1973, 4 years before I moved to the state of Oregon from California, for the amendment, the 14th Amendment, to be once again ratified. And that it had been ratified and de-ratified. I never heard of that.
Right.
So much of it was very mean and shocking and upsetting.
Absolutely. This goes with that comment about things, racist laws being on the books for so long, and then progressive laws taking so long to come forward in Oregon. And I think it was in 2015 or 2016, I don't know, years fly by, but where Mississippi was in the news for finally ratifying the 13th Amendment, which outlaws slavery in the United States except in the case of punishment. We have to be very clear, there's a loophole in the 13th Amendment. But Mississippi waited until, late 2000s to ratify that, right? 2016, 2015. Oregon waited a very long time to ratify certain amendments as well. And just a little social studies review for folks. Sorry if you are like, I paid attention in social studies. But federal law technically supersedes state law. But so when things like amendments are passed, supposedly that is the law of the land. There's been a long history and conversation around states' rights versus federal laws, right? Often states' rights being a code for white supremacy and racism. Oregon definitely rooted itself in that by refusing to pass certain amendments and then passing and then repealing, as what was said, other amendments. So the 14th Amendment, which guarantees universal citizenship rights regardless of race, was ratified and then de-ratified in Oregon, which before I started doing this research 15 years ago, I didn't know you could de-ratify. Wait, what? And then, as was said, wasn't passed again until 1973. The same is true with the 15th Amendment, which outlawed voting discrimination based on race, right? It was not ratified for decades later, 80 years later. So again, this was, as was said, about sending a message about the kind of place Oregon wanted to be.
I find it interesting, the parallels. I'm from Detroit, Michigan, and same stuff.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's a really important point. So this person said they're from Detroit, Michigan, and are surprised by the parallels, that it's the same things, right? And I actually try and tell people across the country that Oregon is an incredibly useful case study for the rest of the nation. Because the thing that's unique about Oregon is Oregon was bold enough to write it down. That's it, right? I have not been great at selling that because a lot of times folks are like, but what do we care about the Midwest? I actually had someone say that to me when I was like, you should study Oregon's history. They're like, the Midwest though? I'm like, oh.
I did not know or remember that Oregon actually elected a member of the KKK, an active member, as governor.
Right. Absolutely. So, Oregon, I think that Klan is a really useful, also a useful case study for America. America likes to tell a lot of racist myths, and the Klan often sits at the heart of many of these. So the myth that the United States tells about the Ku Klux Klan is that the Klan was a fringe organization made up of Southern, working class, not formally educated white men that died out in the 70s, right? None of those things are true. The Klan sat at the heart of the United States on every level. And so and again, Oregon becomes a useful case study for that. So the Ku Klux Klan at its height nationally had 15% of eligible Americans. Americans, 15%. And eligible Americans meant white men, because that's all they wanted, right? So 15% nationally of white men were card-carrying members of the Ku Klux Klan at its height, which is an astronomically high number. You would be hard-pressed to find an organization, right, the Humane Society, for who doesn't like cats and dogs? They don't have those kind of numbers, but the Klan did, right? Also, Oregon had the highest per capita Klan membership in the country. So again, this was about Oregon sending a very clear message about what kind of place it wanted to be. The Klan didn't just have numbers, they reached into the highest echelons of power. And so this picture, which ran in the Oregon Journal in the early 1920s, shows hooded Klansmen posing with the leaders of the city of Portland, right? The police chief, the district attorney, the US attorney, the Multnomah County sheriff, and the Portland mayor posed with hooded Klansmen under the title saying that they were taking guidance from the Klan about what the Klan wanted to see happen in Portland. So this was not just something that reached into Portland, it reached into the state, as was said, right? So Walter Pierce was elected in 1923, was running in 1922 to be governor, and was a member of the Klan, and worked with the Klan to pass state legislation. One big one that folks talk about a lot is the Compulsory Education Act, which was about getting access to all white school-age children in Oregon and attacking institutions like private schools. But they also passed literacy tests for voting, which we often think of as a tool of racist oppression in the South. We had them in Oregon, thanks to Walter Pierce and the Ku Klux Klan, right?
I thought it was interesting,
Oh, I just have one more thing one more. This is gonna tie it all together. But this is the part that I think shows that Oregon is a useful case study for the rest of the nation. Because we have, as president around this time, Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was rabidly pro-Klan. He wrote a pro-Klan history book that was the basis for the novel The Klansman, which was the basis for the film Birth of a Nation. Birth of a Nation is perhaps the most virulently racist film that has ever been created in the history of cinema. It portrays black people as nothing more than animals that need to be kept in check, and it glorifies the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. Birth of a Nation was also the first film that screened in the White House. Woodrow Wilson would show Birth of a Nation to visiting dignitaries as if it were a documentary and say, black people are trying to cry on the international stage about how we treat them. This is why we treat them like that. So it's important to note, again, the Klan was not a fringe organization. The Klan sat at the heart of the United States. Its politics, its ideologies, its principles were not at war with the American ideology. It was deeply intertwined and beneficial to one another. And we can see that on the city level, the state level, and the national level.
Yes, that's what I wanted to say.
Thank you. I was interested to see about the eugenics program touring in the 1930s.
Repeat the question.
Sure. So was interested to see about the eugenics program that was touring in the 1930s in Oregon. So there was an exhibit that received overwhelming praise, both from the media as well as everyday people. 1 in 20 Oregonians went and saw it. And the title is Eugenics in New Germany. In 1935, New Germany is Nazi Germany. And so this was about eugenics, about murdering and sterilizing unfit citizens to breed the best possible race. Oregon loved it, individually and in the media. The Oregon Journal said, taking a tip from Nazi Germany. That was the introduction to the story, which don't ever take a tip from Nazi Germany. But again, it's important to note, I think that Oregon in general, and especially Portland, portrays itself as sort of this, liberal utopia. But these are the foundations of this place that we are. And we can't begin to understand this place without understanding this. I have people come and visit me all the time, and they're like, I had no idea Portland was so white, but it's supposed to be so great here. And I'm like, these are tied together, right? We cannot have the Portland that markets itself as this white liberal playground without this white supremacist, racist foundation. They are intertwined together, and they are inextricable.
I was struck by two particular slides. One was the number of black men who worked in the railroads, the rise of the railroad. And then following that, the development of housing around the train station. And then following that, the rise of the automobile, which created freeways that went directly through the black neighborhood, as well as sports centers. And this is a phenomena that seemed to be happening, as I think this woman pointed out, throughout the country, Los Angeles, Detroit. It was such a blatant, yet, quote, progressive way, and I use that in the sense of we're showing progress. That kind of blew my mind. I had not thought of that intersectionality of cars, the rise of oil and cars, and decimation of black communities.
Absolutely. That is such an important point, and I'm going to come back to that because I want to do a little section specifically for y'all, Luke Oswego, because it's been joking for y'all. But we're going to go back.
Thank you. I will,
We have some.
is it me? I've lived in Portland since the early 70s, and like you were just talking about, I always thought this was a fairly progressive city, and while I was going around Lavana and we were looking at the history, I had heard some of this, but there was so much I didn't know, and it was stunning to me, like the recent repeal of some of the laws. I always thought, oh, you know, I'm pretty liberal, I'm very progressive, and I didn't even realize that there was things I could be doing or should be doing, and it's just mind-boggling to me. So I guess I just want to say I am so sorry, and I am so grateful for this whole conversation. And as much as I hate what's happening right now in our country, the good thing is that it is bringing us together to learn more stuff like this, to help me, at least me, get my eyes open. And I thank you for that, and thank everybody who's here today for that, because sometimes that's what it takes.
Sure. And I think it's important to note that for many folks, for people of color, for black folks, like even if we don't know this history, we know this history.
Yeah.
Walking around here every day, you're like, I know something is trying to crush me. And I feel like when black folks find out, when I found out when I was in high school, I was like, what is wrong with this place? And I find this out and I understand. So I think for folks who are just realizing that, for white folks who are like, oh, this is actually, there are two different Oregons right by each other, and I know nothing about what it's like to live in the Oregon of color. I'm really excited to be doing this program tonight with organizations doing work in the community. So you can get involved, as you were saying, you didn't know there were ways to get involved, right? Respond to Racism and the West Linn Alliance, get involved with organizations that are doing on the ground work. And I will give a little more information about that at the end, but my hope of presenting this information is that folks don't just go, oh, that was interesting, and go home and maybe, like, you know, over coffee be like, oh, I saw this interesting thing, but actually say, there is work for all of us, so where is my work, and how do I do that work?
I grew up in Chicago, and then I spent 9 years in Southern California, and I moved to Eugene, Oregon, and worked at Thurston High School in the early 70s. I was wondering what high school you went to in Springfield.
Springfield High.
Oh, okay. And I was shocked that there were so few black people in Eugene and in Springfield, and then when I moved to Portland,
and talking to people about that, and people began saying, well, you know, we had active KKK here until so-and-so. And I don't know, I just found it pretty shocking and appalling, and I appreciate you putting all this together and making it so clear for people. It certainly answers the question for me why there aren't more black people in Oregon.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
And I think, you know, it's important to note we have active Klan chapters right now, right? There's over 100 active Klan chapters in this country. And the Klan is not the largest white supremacist organization by far at all, right, anymore. So I think it's important, you know, I've been traveling around doing this work for 7 years. I've gone through Oregon Humanities Conversation Project. I've gone to, if you can name a small town in Oregon, I've probably gone there, talking about the history of race, identity, and power. And I travel with security now because I've lost count of the number of the times white supremacists have threatened to come, have shown up, have threatened to sexually assault and murder me and participants, shown up with Confederate flags, tried to disrupt. And I am a professor usually giving a history program at a library. So I think it's important, you know, to share that, to recognize this is not something that is dead and gone. This is something that is organized and active, and it's not something that happened with the election of Trump. This is something that was happening. Folks have become galvanized and better organized, but this is rooted in this place that we live. And I want to just do some of that foundational history because it's not just, like, I think we talk about street level white supremacist violence like the Klan or like white supremacist gangs, but we need to talk about institutional level white supremacist violence. Right? And I try to use those terms to show there's street level white supremacist violence, there's institutional white supremacist violence. They work together, they need one another. And so when we're talking about this place, I've met many Oregonians who are very proud that Oregon came into the Union a free state, right? And while it is true that Oregon outlawed slavery while it was still a territory, I would never call it a free state, because at the same time that Oregon outlawed slavery, it outlawed black people and criminalized our existence. It said that black people were not allowed to live in the Oregon territory. And the first black exclusion law, because there were three, the first black exclusion law included the lash law that said that black people would be publicly whipped every 6 months, up to 39 lashes, until we left the state. And when we say Oregon territory, I said state, but it's territory, because Oregon territory is the entire Northwest. So the Oregon territory is Oregon, Washington, Idaho, parts of Wyoming, parts of Montana. So when we say Oregon territory, we mean the entire Northwest told black people your very existence is a crime, and we will publicly torture you over and over again until you leave. Right? That is the foundation of this place. And so when we ask the question, why aren't there more people of color in Oregon? It's because Oregon and the Northwest was incredibly clear that they did not want folks of color here, and they would do anything necessary to create this white homeland. And the foundation is the ideology of a white, racist white homeland. And you can read that in language like Peter Burnett, who was a legislator who wrote the lash law. It was called Peter Burnett's lash law. He went on to be governor in California. He said the reason for the lash law, the object, is to keep clear of that most troublesome class of population, black people. We are in a new world under the most favorable circumstances, and we wish to avoid most of those evils that have so much afflicted the United States and other countries. So he was very clear this was about creating a racist white utopia. And the brutalization of black folks was about excluding them from that racist white utopia. At the same time, we have all of this land stolen from indigenous folks and given away for free to white settlers. If you were white and you promised to come here and civilize the West, you were given hundreds of acres of free land. That is literally the foundation of the Northwest. And at the end of it, 2.3 million acres were given away for free to white folks, while indigenous folks were forced onto reservations in horrifically brutal marches and policing. So these two examples, these two brutal extreme examples, the Black Exclusion Law, the Oregon Donation Land Act, show that this is the foundation of this place, is the concept of a racist white utopia. And it results in Oregon being the only state in the union admitted with a racial exclusionary clause in its constitution. Oregon's constitution included a Black exclusion law that banned Black people from living in Oregon, from working, from holding real estate, from making contracts. So our very existence, again, was criminalized, and we had no legal standing. The piece that folks have mentioned throughout that is really important is that this language was in Oregon's constitution until 2001. Well, the vote was in 2001, so it wasn't removed until 2002, actually. So until into the 21st century, the Black exclusion law language was in Oregon's constitution. And this was not an oversight. This was not, oh, who could possibly keep track of your founding document and all of the pieces of it? Because the Black community has always been active change makers. They've never been passive victims. Communities of color have never been passive victims. They've been active change makers. And so the Black community came to Oregon, both through the legislature and through the ballot box, again and again for 80 years, and said, remove this language and show us this isn't the kind of place you want to live. And again, white Oregon reaffirmed this is exactly the kind of place we want to live. We will not remove it. And it was a fight to get that language removed in 2001. If you were here, there was immense pushback. It was not at all guaranteed. And a lot of the pushback centered around the idea of wanting to preserve Oregon's history. Which Black people heard loud and clear as wanting to preserve the notion of Oregon as a racist white utopia. And so I think this, to me, this piece is a very important indicator, right? This is the canary in the coal mine that shows us this is not something that is dead and gone and in the past. This is something that is living with us every day. This concept of a racist white utopia is built into the foundations of this entire region and in this nation. And if we actually want to make it a place where there's racial justice, there's going to be a whole lot more work that needs to happen rather than just removing some language from the Constitution.
Can I ask a question?
There's a bunch of folks with microphones.
Okay, well, I have a pretty loud voice.
No, we're gonna actually use the microphone.
Hi. Yes, so a lot of what came up for me when I was in this discovery process is a lot of shame and a lot of sadness, to be honest. And I guess maybe one of the broader questions that come up is like, well, how do you square wanting to be proud for your state, but yet, have all this, something to be really ashamed of, but obviously it's good to know, right? It's an important thing to understand this. But, and at the very end, I guess the bottom line is, what do we do? What are the best things that we can be doing to eradicate institutional racism here?
Well, I will talk about that at the very end. I think if you're going to be proud of something, it needs to prove that there's a reason to be proud of it, right? And I think that, again, for me, Portland is a perfect example of current neoliberal racism nationally. It is incredibly good at saying the right words while allowing the underlying institutions of oppression to continue as business as usual. So that what Portland says and what it does are not in alignment at all for folks of color. And to me, if you are going to say that you are a progressive place, then you have to be a progressive place for everyone. If you are not, then you need to be very clear and say, we are a progressive place if you are rich and white. Then you should come, and it'll be great. But if you're not, just know it's not gonna be good for you. So Portland needs to do one or the other, because it can't say that it is a progressive place while continuing benefiting and propagating these institutions. And I want to again say that Oregon, unfortunately, is not unique, right? This notion of a racist white utopia, that is the foundation of this nation. And that's why Oregon, to me, is a useful case study for the rest of the nation. The founding idea of America is manifest destiny. Literally, the white colonizer said that God gave this land to white folks to make it prosperous because indigenous people were not using it properly, and that they had the right to do whatever was necessary, including chattel slavery, theft of land, and genocide to make it prosper. That's literally, I didn't make that up, I'm not interpreting, that's what those folks who colonized the United States said. So if you are going to be proud of a place, I think that first we would have to do immense amounts of work to reimagine the foundations of that place. And to recognize that it's not just the foundations, it's something that is reinforced again and again. This is a quote from a US senator in the 1900s, right? Not the 1700s, not the 1800s, the 1900s, where he is basically saying that same thing, that God gave, has been preparing the English-speaking and Teutonic peoples for 1,000 years, to take this world and establish their dominance, right? That is the concept of manifest destiny. And so I think, again, Oregon is a useful case study because it allows us to see the truths about this rest of the nation and to really say, if we're going to be proud of this place that we live, are we willing to do the long, hard, deep work to do that? And if not, then you need to be honest about that and say, I'm white and it works for me, right? And then at least everyone knows where we stand. And we know, all right, I see you, and you can stay over there, and we will do what we need to do over here.
My question related to what you were talking about when I raised my hand, and that you were talking about the fact that during all of this horrendous history, that the African Americans were protesting, working to change it, and so forth. My question is, were there any white people or institutions, churches, any kind of groups at all that were joining in that fight against these laws?
Yes, there are white allies that joined in the work, historically and currently. And I think that's important. I do always want to make sure we're rooting in communities of color, because I think the way that the narratives of change happen a lot is the concept that, a white savior comes in. Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. That's not true. I'm not going to go off on my rant. I swear to God I won't go off on it. It's not true, right? Enslaved black folks freed themselves. They freed themselves and they pushed the issue to the point, they said, we will have freedom now or we will change the entire world until that happens. And that's exactly what they did. The reason that slavery ended, except in the case of punishment in this nation, is enslaved black folks. The reason that racial justice has advanced is people of color. Right? It is due entirely to the courage, determination, drive, and bravery of folks of color. The minute there was repression, there was resistance. And I think it's often hard to see with this timeline because there are so many instances of horrific things happening, but a third of the timeline are communities organizing, communities building, communities fighting back, communities winning. And so I think to me, it's incredibly important to root this understanding of history because we don't talk about it, and then when we do, we talk about it in a way that depowers folks of color, makes them passive victims waiting for a white savior. I just want to say very clearly, people of color don't need saviors, they need allies. If you want to be a savior, and so maybe I'll talk a little bit about that, combining it with housing stuff, because I know time is getting short. So just don't look at it. I'm going to go through it really fast. For some reason, it's not working. But I think, it's important, the idea of creating space is really important, and it's been incredibly important for black folks in Oregon, again, in a place that told us we would be tortured if we stayed. And over 100 black people heard black exclusion law passed, and they stayed, or they came. That, to me, is the height of courage and bravery. And they made it possible for me to be here. I would not be here if it was not for those over 100 black folks who heard, we will publicly torture you until you leave, and they said, well, I'm not leaving, so what are we gonna do about this, right? So the black community has always been here, and the black community has always built. And so, you know, specifically looking at the experience of the black community in Portland, again, becomes a useful case study for the rest of the nation. Because if we look at the patterns of containment, of redlining, of segregation, of urban renewal, and then of gentrification, we see the same things happening, as you were saying, across the country. And so I'm gonna just do this super briefly, and I'm gonna share a resource with you that talks a lot more in depth about it, just because this could have been the whole presentation and more. But the first black community actually came around the train station, around Union Station, because the majority of black folks came with the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. And so the first sort of black institution that really took root was the Golden West Hotel, because all of Portland was closed to black folks. Portland was considered to be the most segregated city north of the Mason-Dixon line. So the most segregated city outside of the South, Portland. The entirety of downtown was closed to black folks. Black folks could not get a room, could not see a doctor, could not get a shoe shine, a haircut, nothing. So institutions like the Golden West Hotel sprung up to address those needs. And while it was a hotel, it quickly also became a community center. So this building still exists in downtown Portland in Northwest, and there's actually information on the outside of it about the Golden West. There's also an online component that you can check out. So if you look up the Golden West Hotel, you can hear audio from folks who stayed at the Golden West Hotel, from the owners of it. You can learn more about it. So I think, again, in terms of the physical manifestations, people walk by this building every day and have no idea that this was the heart of the black community, the first black community in Portland. But the downtown expanded, that land became desirable, and black folks were displaced. They were displaced across the Broadway Bridge to Lower Albina, which is where the Moda Center is right now. So if you go to see Blazers or whatever, I went to see the dinosaurs walking around. Something about me. That was the heart of the black community. And black folks were only allowed to buy or rent in that area due to redlining. The practice literally of drawing red lines around a map and saying within this area is the only place that black folks and sometimes other folks of color can buy or rent. And it's usually the least desirable part of town. So redlining made that the place that black folks lived. Black people made it the heart of the black community. Under the worst of conditions, they created a thriving, strong community. And just one thing I want to highlight with that is it became known as a jazz treasure nationally. So folks would come and play in Portland. All the greats played in Portland. You could hear jazz 24 hours a day on North Williams Avenue. And I think that this, to me, is such a powerful symbol of the culture of resistance that folks created. Again, in a situation where they're overexploited and under-resourced, they still created this beautiful culture of resistance that everyone acknowledged as something powerful nationally. So we have that as, and I'm skipping over so much. We have that Lower Albina as the heart of the black community right up until around 1955, 1956. And this is the piece that I would encourage everyone to read, Bleeding Albina by Karen Gibson. It is an incredible piece looking at the process of gentrification and containment in the black community. She does an amazing job of connecting this with the national landscape as well. Because again, what happens in 1956 is the black community, the heart of the black community is demolished to put in the Memorial Coliseum. It is literally dropped on top of the black community. North Williams, which again was the heart of the black community, is cut in half and basically left to bleed to death. At the same time, the highways go in. And this is the part that's important for everyone and useful for, I think, for Lake Oswego. The reason highways are going in across this country is because of the suburbs, the creation of the suburbs, right, which started during World War II. The suburbs were created as a place for white people to get away from the city, to get away from people of color, to get away from crime, to be able to build the sort of utopia that they had dreamed of. Sounds familiar, right? That's the foundation of Oregon as a state, the racist white utopia. The vast majority of suburbs were sundown suburbs, sundown towns, which meant black folks and other people of color were not allowed to live there, including Lake Oswego, right? It was written into the covenants of people's homes, and I've seen people's covenants from Lake Oswego, black people who own a home here, and their covenant says, you are not, like black folks are not allowed to enter Lake Oswego except as domestic servants. That is in, you know, the paperwork for the home that they own in Lake Oswego. The reason highways go in is because people need quick ways to come back from the suburbs to their jobs in the cities, right? So highways go in across this nation, right? And so it's incredibly important to recognize that this process that's happening in Portland is happening in, you know, New York, as was said, LA, Chicago, Detroit, across this nation, because of the creation of these new spaces called the suburbs, places where white folks wanted to go and build perfect, idealized communities. And there's a great book called Sundown Towns by James Lowen, and he has an entire section where he talks about the suburbs, because he says the highest percentage of sundown towns, which again are purposely all white towns that are policed by violence or threat of violence. The idea of sundown towns, again, we often think, oh, it's something in the South or in rural areas. He's like, the biggest number of sundown towns is the suburbs, right? Is where people with money who could get out went. That is the biggest number of sundown towns. And he actually has a great online project where if you just Google sundown towns, this is the first page that comes up. This map is an interactive map. So you can click on it, and then it'll have a list of towns that they have evidence are sundown towns for the state that you clicked on. So I did a tour 2 years ago of rural Oregon, and I clicked on this map during the presentation every time, and every single one of those towns was on that map, and people were not. They were like, oh. There was one that wasn't, and I was like, y'all, you're not on the map, and they're like, we should be. But I think, again, this is really important, because I think that oftentimes the suburbs think of it as separate from the cities, but recognizing that the suburbs and their existence indelibly shape racial politics of cities, that there is no way to walk away from that accountability or that culpability for that. Where's the...
Okay, is it on? Yeah, it is. Am I loud enough? So as a PSU student, I'm a criminology major, and a huge conversation in all of my classes in my major is police brutality, obviously. And we had previously learned about, I actually took a Portland race studies class. And we learned about, I believe it was the Stevenson's case, where they had the "don't choke them, smoke them" slogan, and I was so shocked to see, when we saw pictures of Portland police even wearing that shirt under their uniforms and wearing those out and about on duty. And I was just shocked to see it even again for the second time.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think recently with the ruling in the Eric Garner case, who was, as a black man, who was choked to death by police in New York City in 2015, who said, "I can't breathe" 11 times as they were choking him to death. They just ruled that there will be no indictments in that case, that the police did no wrongdoing. For Portland, for Black Portland, there was a very visceral response to hearing that, because Black Portland remembers 1985, Roy Stevenson, who was a good Samaritan who stopped a robbery from happening, and when police showed up, they choked him to death, even though the clerk at the store was saying, "That's not him, he stopped the robbery, he's the good guy." The police were on suspension. The day of his funeral, police wore t-shirts that had 2 smoking guns that said, "Don't choke them, smoke them." So the police officers who created those t-shirts were fired and rehired. The police officers who murdered Lloyd Stevenson were found not guilty of wrongdoing. There has never been a case in Portland where a police officer was found guilty of wrongdoing and stayed fired. What happens is they get rehired and then they get back pay. So they basically just got a really nice vacation for executing a person. We're gonna just take one more.
You know by my voice that I'm not from Oregon. I wonder how many in this room have been in Oregon for 50 years and experienced the great Lake Oswego with a lot of money. How many have?
How many people have been in Oregon for 50 years?
How many of you remember Kay Bogle or Dick Bogle, the first commissioner? And did anyone know that Kay was on the Reed College board as an African American? And I met her in 1963, and we became friends. And I wonder about education in general. I've self-taught at Martin Luther King, you know, the dominant league. And it's not like I can fix anything. But with all this information that you are imparting to us, what could we do individually, no matter where we came from or who we knew or whatever? When I left California, only 3 years there, I heard there were more colleges per capita in Oregon than in California. So that impressed me. I mean, this is supposed to be an intelligent crowd. Everyone bow now. What can we do?
Right.
How can we restore? How can we remember Kay Bogle, you know, Dick Bogle? How can we improve by the knowledge that you're imparting to us?
Yeah, so I want to move to sharing some statistics about the current state and then talk a little bit, and I want to end because we're actually over time that we started. What?
Can we just get one more? It's real quick.
Okay.
Yes, I wonder how many people in the room would be surprised to know that within the past 2 years, the Klan deposited leaflets all over Gresham through the neighborhood with candies. Yeah, so I wonder how many people, raise your hand if you'd be surprised to find that out. Don't we need to know that that is not only them, but it's now?
Yeah. So it was a reference that recently the Klan had been flyering in multiple Oregon cities and towns. So the Klan had been flying in multiple Oregon cities and towns, including in schools, and included candies attached to the flyers recruiting for the Klan. Again, I think that's important. It's also important to note the Klan is not the largest white supremacist organization in Oregon, and they are also incredibly actively recruiting and flyering. We are having, patriot prayers, and these movements have been organized and emboldened, but they have existed historically. This is important, and this has to be combated. And we have to talk about institutional racism. Because the reality is if every white supremacist organization, street-level white supremacist organization disappeared tomorrow, the situations and conditions of the majority of people of color would not be radically improved or changed. Because the white supremacy is built into the institutions, and they work in tandem with one another. Institutional white supremacy works in tandem and supports street-level white supremacist violence. We have to understand that. So when we're talking about, we need more police to protect us from white supremacist violence like what happened on the MAX train a couple years ago, the reality is that we see that the Portland police have actually killed more people this year per capita than any other city in this nation, per capita, which is astronomical. Everyone else's numbers have been declining, Portland's has been rising. So recognizing that looking to institutions that are rooted in white supremacy to save us from street level white supremacy is jumping from the pot into the fire. But I do want to just wrap up. So it's going to get depressing, and then hopefully I'll leave you with like a little bit of hope. Some folks got handouts that were the State of Black Oregon statistics from 2015, which was the last time the Urban League of Portland put out their publication, The State of Black Oregon. You can download it for free online, and I would encourage everyone to do that, The State of Black Oregon. It has statistics and dozens of indicators. I think it's over 100-page report, so it is really powerful and meaty. But we don't have enough for everyone, so usually I do a small group activity, but I was like, oh, that's not gonna work. So I wanted to pull out, basically, it's not a spoiler, that across every indicator, there are gross disparities between Black folks and white folks across Oregon. And that gap has been growing. It has not been reducing, right? So all of the indicators have stayed the same or gotten worse since 2015. The result that they came out was an incredibly expansive visionary report that includes information. It also includes policy objectives, organizing, priorities. So when people say, well, what can I do? I'm like, well, this organization spent years putting together a guide that gives you probably 75 to 100 things that you could be doing, right? So I just pulled out one section that was on housing, since I talk about it a lot. So you can kind of see there's a vision statement with more information, a problem statement, what is the issue, there's quotes from community members, and then there's activities, priorities, ideas about why is this important, and then how do we begin to do it, as well as highlighting some folks who are already doing that work in the community. So if you're like, oh, I really want to get involved in this, there may be organizations in this report that say, that's great, we're already doing that work, so you should come bring your expertise to us. And this is just a list I've been compiling since I started the program of organizations working on racial justice in Oregon. And I like to end with this because it's a lot of names. It was hard to get that all on one slide. And obviously you can't read all of that, right? And I actually have to update it because I was given some more names. So I'm like, oh, that font's gonna get smaller. But there are thousands, if not tens of thousands of folks working every single day around racial justice in the state of Oregon. There are organizations to connect with on every level. So whatever your interest is, whatever your expertise is, and whatever your time availability is, there are ways to get involved with that. And there are organizations right here tonight that you can talk to, Respond to Racism and the West Linn Alliance. So, again, there are always places to plug in and to connect to the work that's happening, to take the leadership of folks of color and fundamentally change the future of this place. Thank you all so much for coming.